Thomas, welcome along to the podcast, mate. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about your column, The World is Cooling. Now, ordinarily, that would be good news, given that we're all worried about climate change at the moment. But you are talking about more like international relations and foreign policy, sparked by the live fire drills that it seemed captured New Zealand for last week that the Chinese Navy did in the Tasman Sea, as we heard reports of them slowly moving down the coast of Australia, then into the Tasman Sea, and then the mass exodus of New Zealanders to Australia was interrupted briefly as they had to divert flights and things like that. And you make the point that everyone in New Zealand was kind of shocked by this, but the rest of the world was kind of like, we kind of expected this. How was that?
Yeah, for sure. And so it's worth mentioning at the outset that nothing that the Chinese Navy did was in contravention of international law. They were allowed to do it, but the normal courtesy shown is that you mention when your warships are showing up near other countries, and particularly when you're undertaking exercises. But yeah, New Zealand seemed really caught out by this, as if it was a surprising expansion of Chinese activities. And it is an expansion, but they've been getting more and more outgoing, shall we say, for some time. In the column, I make the joke to the Australian political sitcom Utopia. Wonderful, wonderful show. But 8 years ago, they were joking about unaligned regional players threatening our strategic interests. It's the country that cannot be named. That the Australian Defence Force was investing money investing $400 billion to protect themselves from unaligned players and strategic interests without naming trade routes in China. But certainly China's expansion has been causing concern in Australia and certainly globally for some time. It's not uncommon to hear commentators talk about the second Cold War not starting soon, already being upon us.
So that's kind of that 8 years ago frame of them joking about it, is they kind of knew 8 years ago that this was a thing, a second Cold War, where he who shall not be named is talked about and kind of plotted against, and strategies are made just in case, and scenarios are run and things like that. But New Zealand hasn't caught up with that. It's caught us kind of on the back foot then, hasn't it, in terms of because now we're all talking about defense spending and intelligence sharing and Five Eyes and why didn't we know and all this stuff. So we've kind of been caught napping in a sense, haven't we?
Absolutely. And I think it's a classic New Zealand thing to be very passive about international relations and foreign policy. We're a country that believes deeply in fairness, and we want things to be fair. And so we almost seem to go into the international arena looking for a fair exchange and negotiation, but nothing about international relations is fair. And so we end up kind of being on the back foot, as you say.
And you made the point that we have been under the impression that there has been a fair, what do they call it, the rules-based international order for the last 70 years or so, but that's almost an illusion.
Yeah, well, there certainly has been a rules-based order, and it has been a very good thing for trade. So I think we should be pro the rules-based order. But I think the problem we fell into was thinking that this international liberalism and rules-based order was based on some fairness and the high ideals of humanity, that it just sort of would come to a point as humans where we could do this.
Yes.
But the reality is that it was always downstream of American power. After World War II, we had the emergence of the Cold War, but then ultimately America became the one hegemon, the one great power in the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And because America underwrote secure trading lanes and America was pro-free trade, the world got on board. But it was always a practical, realpolitik decision of America, not some high ideal.
Wasn't something that we all came together and like, guys, we're so enlightened now, we should all just get along and live in this one great world.
Absolutely. It was altogether more cynical and human than that. We like to think this aspirational unity of a globalized and increasingly the world is local feel. But in reality, it's still power and negotiation and trade-offs.
So is this one of the things that have kind of been brought up in some of the commentary around this incident with the Chinese Navy is that this is a bit of a tit for tat, like New Zealand and Australia sent we kind of cruised through the Taiwan Strait close to China, and now they're like, well, look, we'll just go down and do that. Is that a tit for tat, or is it a genuine expansion of Chinese presence in the Indo-Pacific?
I mean, I think both turns of phrase are helpful for thinking about it. It is a tit for tat in that China is responding to New Zealand and Australia sailing through the Taiwan Strait, but it is an escalation for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Taiwan Strait is still an international trade route. And then the second thing is that China will talk about us sailing through their territorial waters. It's fair to say those are also Taiwan's territorial waters.
Yes.
So we don't formally acknowledge Taiwan as an independent nation because that's too awkward to talk about. But there is a real difference there that New Zealand and Australian ships, along with American ones, sail through the Taiwan Strait to assert that we insist on our rights to be there as part of an international trade route and our interest in Taiwan maintaining a degree of independence, even if we don't name them as a nation.
Yes.
So China is responding to say we can do this too. And so from their perspective, they are engaging in a tit-for-tat relationship. But for us, it is a real escalation.
And I guess the difference is that the Tasman Sea is not necessarily an international trade route that lots of ships travel through.
No, and the nations on both sides of that stretch of water were less than impressed by China unannounced arriving in those waters, whereas on one side of the Taiwan Strait, they're quite happy for these ships to sail through, whereas it's only on the other side, in the People's Republic of China, that they are unimpressed by that. So there is a real difference there.
And so the other thing that's come out of this has been calls to increase defense spending, which has been, as you say here, chronic underinvestment in our defense. Why have we been? Is it just we've been thinking about the rules-based international order as the way things are, and so we don't need defense, or is it why have we been underspending so much, and how much have we underspent?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to draw out there. So I think the first challenge for thinking about New Zealand defense spending is because we aren't a great power, we could never invest enough in our defense to defend ourselves from all enemies. We could not build a military that could defend us from a hostile America or a hostile China or even a hostile Australia if they got on board with this new trend of announcing desires to annex islands near you. But so because we don't have this clear goal of complete territorial integrity against all hostile powers, it's hard to think strategically about how much we should even invest. What are our goals? What are our capabilities that we are desiring? And then the second thing is that New Zealand has never voted in an election on the basis of foreign policy. It's not in politicians' selfish interests to talk a lot about this. So it's easy to just leave it on the back burner when we have so many constraints. In terms of how much we've been spending, Niall Ferguson, speaking at the recent ARC conference, was talking about America's spending on defense. And he notes that in 2025, for the first time since the 30s, nearly 100 years, America will be spending more money on interest on their debt than their military.
Wow.
And we think about the Americans as the classic over-investing in their defense.
We're
they
like those guys spend more
money
than the next 10 countries put together on their military. And this great military-industrial complex, but that's less than the interest on their debt.
Yeah, this year for the first time in nearly 100 years. Wow. And I thought, that's interesting. Well, what about us?
No.
And so I asked, I went looking, and it turns out the government had actually on their website, Budget 2024, had made the comparison between interest rates. But the comparison was that in our 2024 budget, they're forecasting this year we'd spend $8.8 billion on interest on our debt. Wow. So a reasonable amount of money.
Yes.
But to give that some context, that's not only more than we spend on our defense force, it's $1 billion more than we spend on the defense force, police, corrections, and customs combined.
No.
So you think about all of those kind of all of those agencies that are tasked with security, international security, the defense, our domestic security, the police, the integrity of our borders with customs, and incarceration with corrections. So for us, we're not close to spending more money on our defense than interest.
Yeah.
But we do have because we have these high debt payments, we have relatively limited capacity to increase our defense spending. So it's not as simple as saying we need to spend more.
Yeah. So how would we then go about allocating that spending? If we want to spend strategically, because we can't, as you say, we can't be a world-dominating superpower when it comes to military.
Yeah.
We need alliances. So what's the best strategic way for us to move forward?
Yeah, well, I think
in your opinion.
Yeah. So I think the strategic question raises the key dilemma in that we do a tremendous amount of trade with China. We don't want to offend them because that trade is really important to us.
Because they are our biggest trading partner as well, aren't they? So,
absolutely. But to spend most effectively on our defense force, what we have to really do is ask our allies, what capabilities do you think would be helpful for us to cooperate with you? Because then we can spend effectively. And the quid pro quo, the trade would be we spend in ways that coordinate with them and they in turn help us with capabilities we don't have.
So we would go to Australia and say, where can we help?
Yeah, how can New Zealand and Australia have a well-rounded, coordinated strategy, particularly focused on the Pacific, our backyard? But the challenge with that is that's the most efficient way to spend our money. It pushes us in closer alignment with our allies and then risks offending China. So the spending decision cannot be made independently of the alignment decision or the kind of foreign policy decisions. And so we have this key dilemma that we can't avoid.
Yeah. So how do we navigate that? I mean, is it just trying to do the best we can? What's the pragmatic, we're Kiwis, so, we're all about what's the most pragmatic way to do it. What do you think should be the government's steps? Obviously, Winston Peters was in China just recently. And so is that the way to do it? Diplomacy or?
So I think, multi-pronged approach, to get kind of jargony with it. But I think there is a diplomacy and there's an alignment question. So we need to proactively manage our relationship with China. We need to continually communicate with them that we are happy to keep trading. We are a pro-trading nation. But we also need to insist upon our independent foreign policy, and that independence allows us to align where we want to. And so we should be continuing to invest in ways that make sense with those allies who we expect to be long-term allies like Australia.
Yeah.
And the final pragmatic observation is that America is seen as increasingly unreliable, and the current administration is quite distasteful. We saw on the weekend that particularly controversial press conference between Trump and Zelensky, and J.D. Vance was there as well. And the pragmatic observation is that it doesn't matter whether we like America. We're not obliged to like them. The question is, how do we deal with them? How do we cooperate with them? Because dealing with them is unavoidable.
Yes.
We don't enter into the world stage on a fair and level playing field. There are great powers whose decisions affect us far more than our decisions affect them. And so we have to be able to show up, negotiate with America, do a deal, as the Donald likes to say, and then also recognize that their administrations will change. American leaders come and go, and their foreign policy will change. So we have to be willing to continue to engage with them, even if we find them a bit distasteful.
So take the world as we find it, be realistic, take a long view of things, but also be more strategic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just that humble recognition that the world isn't fair.
Yeah.
And we just have to make the best of it.
Yeah. Wow. Thomas, thanks for being with us. Lots of good things to think about and chew on, and hopefully we'll keep an eye on this foreign policy situation as we go forward, and we'll see some good things. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Even in the internet age, international news still arrives in New Zealand by boat. Recent live fire exercises from Chinese naval vessels in the Tasman Sea redirected flights and raised a flurry of alarm. If anything could have woken us up to a changing world, it was disruption, however brief, to the mass exodus of Kiwis to Australia. This follows hot on the heels of the Cook Islands Chinese trade deal made without New Zealand's consultation. For a trading nation like New Zealand, the rules-based international order has been crucial. Free trade with China has contributed meaningfully to our prosperity, trade we can't easily give up. Even our independent foreign policy, often a fig leaf for rudderless nationalism, has served us pretty well. But the world has changed. We acted as though the rules-based order had replaced great power politics. The institutions of international liberalism believed their own hype. High ideals and global stability have always been downstream of American power. None of these observations are new. The Second Cold War began some time ago. It just took time for the light to reach our distant galaxy. 8 years after the Australian sitcom Utopia was joking about unnamed, unaligned regional players threatening our strategic interests. The show poked fun at the government's unwillingness to call China what it was, a power too obvious to ignore, yet too inconvenient to name. Last week's scare has renewed concerns about chronic underinvestment in our defence forces. Forget improving capability. We need to replace a boat, and we have army barracks that couldn't pass a rental warrant of fitness. More money is needed, but it's money we don't have. Neil Ferguson, speaking at the recent ARC conference, lamented that in 2025, for the first time since the 1930s, America would spend more on debt servicing than on defence. If only we were so lucky. In Budget 2024, our interest payments on government debt were $8.8 billion, $1 billion more than we spent on the Defence Force, police, corrections, and customs combined. Even with increased defence spending, we aren't large or wealthy enough to make our military self-reliant. We can choose high capability, or we can choose independence. We can't have both. Strengthening our military capability would necessarily involve closer alignment with Australia, and ultimately, America. The contentious public spat over the weekend between Trump and Vance and Ukrainian President Zelensky left a bitter taste in the mouths of many observers. But however distasteful and erratic the current American regime, we still need them. It's the American Navy, not European good manners, that underwrites our ability to safely export around the world. Rejecting this reality isn't just wishful thinking, it's a dangerous act of naivete. The world is unfair. International relations are essentially feudal, and minor barons don't get to dictate the rules to great kings. An unstable world doesn't require us to be less humane, but we must be shrewder. Defence investment is necessary. Strategic alignment may be unavoidable, but realpolitik is inevitable.